Kevin David Mitnick was born in Los Angeles in the 1960s. Born in California's One Nisi district on August 6, 1963, Kevin's parents divorced when he was a baby. His mother, Shally, with whom he lived, had to work long hours to support the household, and Kevin spent most of that time alone. He spent his time alone making small discoveries on the streets of Los Angeles. He was a very, very curious child, but most importantly, his interest in technology and communication tools blossomed at an early age. In his early adolescence, he began to dabble in amateur radio, listening even to police radio frequencies, trying to decipher the world around him. It was perhaps in these childhood curiosities that the foundation of the skills that would later be called social engineering was laid. So much so that when Kevin was only 12 years old, he already had the famous idea for the first hack of his life. On the city buses he took to and from school, he noticed that the drivers would punch tickets for approval. Seeing this, little Kevin immediately came up with a plan. If he could get his hands on one of these hole punchers and find enough free tickets, he could travel around the city for free. His tactic to find out the secret of the hole punch was simple, and he did it in the best way possible. Being a sweet and innocent boy, he directly asked the bus driver where he could find a hole punch for his school project. The only thing that made the driver suspicious was that he told him where the hole punch was sold, and Kevin managed to buy one there using the same trick. After observing the drivers for a while, he discovered that at the end of the day, most of them threw their empty, unused transfer tickets in the trash bin near the bus station. Then everything was ready. He took the empty tickets, filled them up, punched them, and thus had unlimited ticket rights. At the age of 12, he cheated the system and traveled all over Los Angeles for free for months until he was caught. But his battle with the system was just beginning. By the time he reached high school, he was increasingly eager to push the boundaries of technology. In high school, he continued his hobby of amateur radio while trying to demystify telephone systems. Occasionally, for fun, he would tune into the frequency of McDonald's drive-through systems and make fun of people trying to order by talking to them when the employee should be talking and taking the order. But he wasn't financially concerned. He was just having fun. In high school, he had befriended a slightly older guy who was a phone line hacker, and he learned from him some ways to make long-distance calls for free. So now, he could make long-distance calls for free, but he was going to do things that would make even his friend, who he had learned this from, jaw-dropping. He was naturally gifted in the art of fooling people, which is called social engineering. Or perhaps it should be called social engineering because of him. So much so that at the age of 17, he could convince telephone company employees of almost anything over the phone or face-to-face. He knew their jargon, internal codes and procedures by heart, and presented himself as an insider. For example, he once called the phone company's confidential numbers office, the office where, for example, celebrity numbers are kept, introduced himself as Jake Roberts, and took the number out of the other person's mouth, saying, "Our extension has changed. Have you been notified of our new number?" Then he called a mid-level manager in the same company and asked if your extension would still be on the list, as we were updating the list of authorized personnel, and got his name and extension number, with the answer, "Oh, my number is 354. Finally, using all the information he had, he put a temporary redirect on that manager's phone, so that when the Secret Numbers Bureau called the manager to confirm the information, the call would be forwarded to Kevin, and our adolescent Kevin, in his role as a manager, would either confirm or deny the call to the officer calling him. He recorded the company's on-hold music on his stereo, and took things to the next level by playing the company's own theme music on his stereo when he said, "I'll put you on hold for a minute. Hold the line." He even used this method to access the numbers of famous actors and singers who were trying to hide their numbers at the time. But all that aside, Kevin's main superpower was not his technical skill, but his understanding of human psychology, despite his young age. Of course, it wasn't just about making phone calls. It was also during this period that he became seriously acquainted with computer technologies. When he was 16 or 17 years old, a friend gave him the phone number of a computer system at the University of Southern California Informatics Center. This central computer, nicknamed the Ark, or Noah's Ark, was being used by a large technology company, Digital Equipment Corporation, for remote software development. Kevin, who had succumbed to our curiosity, gathered his courage and connected to the Ark, that is, to this remote main computer with a landline phone, and managed to copy an important operating system software of the DEC company from the system. To do this, he first called the company and posed as an employee whose information had been lost and opened a new account. He then had this new account given high-level authorization and had DEC's secret software sent to his account at the company. All he had to do was find a floppy disk and go to DEC's building and physically get his hands on the information. Again, this was back in the 1970s when he was a teenager and he was using a landline phone. And all of this was frightening for his future. And this was how a teenager, not even a minor, was able to penetrate the network of an entire corporation. Of course, his jealous friends, seeing the unbelievable things he was doing, reported him, but he was given a stern warning for not using any files or damaging any information. But that was the first time he was caught. Did he know that what he was doing could have legal consequences? I don't know. What mattered to him at that moment was that he had broken through the barriers and got into the system. Now young Kevin had the 1989 180-something years ahead of him when he would own a computer. In the 1980s, Kevin Mitnick was slowly making a name for himself in the hacker underworld, and he wasn't trying to get rich from it, but rather to satisfy his curiosity and overcome challenges. Sometimes he would copy software belonging to a company, sometimes he would manipulate a telephone switchboard to make free calls, and sometimes he would break into a system just to push the envelope. In all these cases, his greatest weapon was not his high technical knowledge, but his mastery of deceiving people. Instead of cracking passwords, he preferred to deceive the person who knew the password. By the mid-1980s, Kevin had infiltrated the offices of the Pacific Bell Telephone Company, later known as AT&T, and attempted to steal technical documents. He took 2 friends with him and entered the archives of the company building at night. Before doing so, he had gone to the building during the daytime, introduced himself to the security guard as an employee, and even asked permission to show his friends around the building in the evening. In the evening, when no one was inside, the young men rummaged through the shelves and found a list of passwords to different centers of the telephone network. They didn't get caught that night, but the company was big and the owners were ambitious. A few days later, he realized he was being followed, but this realization did not help him. FBI agents were at his house. The first time he was arrested in this raid, Kevin Mitnick was accused of stealing technical documents belonging to Pacific Bell. His case was tried in juvenile court, and he was sentenced to a few months in a reform school. Kevin thus became one of the youngest people in the world to be convicted of a computer crime. But when he got out of reform school, he had no intention of settling down. For practice, Nora had infiltrated a highly critical US military computer network. But that was it. She managed to infiltrate and get out. She didn't get any inside information, and again, she didn't have any financial concerns. Then the first version of the internet, the ARPANET, came along, and this time she tried to infiltrate the Pentagon through the internet. It was all a game for him, and unfortunately, he had no fear. But finally, in 1988, Kevin Mitnick was officially brought to justice. A year earlier, in 1987, he had managed to hack into the networks of 2 major computer companies with a friend, and that friend had sold Kevin to the FBI. He was only 25 years old and had spent most of his youth playing hacker games. He was on trial for various computer crimes, including all the incidents he had been involved in the past. There was nothing to do, and he pleaded guilty to the charges against him. He was sentenced to a year in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and this time he was really behind bars. When he was released from prison in 1989, he was given strict rules. He was to stay away from computer and telephone systems, and not to get involved in any telecommunications fraud. In short, he was asked to give up his old habits, but he was Kevin and not the obedient type. He tried to behave for a while and even worked as a receptionist, but he only managed to stay away from computers for about 2 years. In 1992, just before the end of his probation, Mitnick couldn't take it anymore. He had again infiltrated the systems of the Pacific Bell Telephone Company that had caught him in the past, and this time he had set his sights on the voicemail system. In his own words, he had done it out of curiosity and a desire for a challenge. However, he was now very specific, and he was caught again, both because of his procedure and the fact that his methods had already been solved. This time, however, he had no intention of surrendering and was going to make a name for himself by escaping. Kevin had disappeared. He was the first hacker to appear on the most wanted list of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. Newspapers referred to him as the #1 fugitive in cyberspace. He was constantly moving around, taking up residence in different cities under different identities, and hoping to leave no digital trace. Everywhere he went, he tried to live like an ordinary citizen, trying not to draw attention to himself. And in the process, he lost the excess weight he had gained over the years, exercised and changed his appearance as much as possible. In this way, he was relatively no match for the old overweight photographs printed in the newspapers. Of course, while he was doing all this, the FBI was not idle. They were tapping his phones and using technology to the fullest to track him down. But he was no idle man, you see. Sensing that FBI agents were preparing an operation to catch him in Los Angeles in 1993, Kevin hacked into Pacific Bell's system and started tapping the phones of FBI agents assigned to his case. Thus, he could be aware of the agents' plans in advance. According to a legend, when the FBI came to one of Kevin's nomadic houses at that time for a raid, they found no one inside. There was only a box of donuts waiting for them with the words, "Donuts for the FBI" written on it. Kevin managed to rip it off, almost mocking them. But their time was not just spent on the run. Not only was he on the run, he was also continuing to earn the title of the greatest hacker in history. At a time when the internet and cell phone networks were rapidly evolving, he was using both old social engineering tricks and new technological tricks to hack into the systems of giant corporations. And giant is not an exaggeration. He got hold of the source code for Motorola's newest phone, the Ultralight. He did this by posing as an engineer from another office of the company and tricking the poor employee. His counterpart believed the deception and was convinced to send him the secret passwords in the mail. Kevin would later describe this attempt as the hack he was most proud of. He managed to infiltrate Novell, one of the biggest computer companies of the time, Fujitsu and Sun Macrosystems, which would later become the world's largest software company. He got hold of their valuable source code, downloaded their software, but most importantly, once he had all this information, he destroyed it. So he hadn't sold or misused any of it up to that point. It was enough for him to know he could do it. When he was on the run, he had access to the credit card information of more than 20,000 people over a period of months, but the scenario was the same. He catches the fish, he releases it back into the wild. For example, instead of asking someone for confidential information, he often used the tactic of telling them false information and asking them to correct it. One time he called the police department and introduced himself as a traffic department officer and asked if your application code was 36-472. The police officer on the other end said, "No, our code is 62-883, i.e., he disclosed the correct code and this gave him access to his new identity. He handled all his affairs calmly and gently, but each time the circle got a little tighter. The next stop was in North Carolina, on America's East Coast. Mitnick had rented an apartment in a development called the Players Club in Raleigh under a false identity. He was now on the other side of the country, and he hoped he had eluded his pursuers. He had lived here quietly for a while, keeping a normal routine during the day so as not to attract attention. At night, of course, he sat at the computer, connecting to remote servers and practicing his skills. But this time he was more careful and cautious than usual. One of his genius ideas was to use cloned cell phones. With special devices, he would clone other people's cell phone IDs and make his calls using these fake IDs, so that even if the security services could identify the number he was calling from, it would actually belong to another person. This made it even more difficult to catch him. But even though he thought he had lost his trail, it was impossible not to leave behind some digital clues. In particular, the pseudonyms he used while surfing the internet and the files he stole could have been clues for someone who knew how to track him down, which is exactly what Kevin did when he spotted a target that flattered his hacker pride and triggered a process that would lead to his downfall. The target was Tsutomu Shimomura, a renowned computer security expert. Shimomura was a Japanese-American scientist and a recognized expert in computer security, to the point of being a consultant to the government. So he was a self-sufficient man up until that time. But around the same time, Kevin was on the hunt for the software he needed to do more advanced hacks on cell phones, and he heard that Shimomura might have a copy of this special software that allowed him to remotely control cell phones. So both his need for the software and his boundless ambition came into play. He wanted to teach that so-called security expert a lesson. So on the night of December 25th, 1994, with the help of an Israeli hacker friend, he carried out this infiltration operation and managed to get the information from Shimomura's home computer. When he had finished, he was ecstatic. He had outsmarted the man who for years had thought he was one of the world's top security experts and crushed his ego. But he would soon learn through bitter experience that his euphoria would not last long. When Shimomura returned home from his Christmas vacation, he was horrified by what he found. His computer had been broken into, some files had been stolen, and he knew immediately that it was Kevin who had done it, both for his bravery and his skill. But about a year ago, Shimomura had realized that Kevin was trying to hack him and had taken precautions, installing a monitoring tool that kept a record of the system. This was a precaution that Kevin, unfortunately, did not take into account. Shimomura analyzed the records and found out where the files had been transferred. He then notified the FBI, and the entire team joined forces and prepared to take Kevin down. In January 1995, Shimomura and a few other specialists began to monitor Kevin's online activities in real time, thanks to the precaution he had taken in the past. They even had all of Kevin's chats with that Israeli friend. Between the way he had obtained credit card information, the way he had infiltrated major corporations, the FBI once again realized what kind of man they were dealing with. On the night between February 13th and February 14th, the FBI team, including Shimomura, raided the apartment complex where he lived. They had waited around the complex for a day and had pinpointed Kevin's apartment when his signal was strongest. The teams were inside with the sounds of the FBI open up. Inside, Kevin lay on the floor in fear. This was the sad end of the most legendary hacker in history, driven by his own ambition. As the days passed after his arrest and he entered the courtroom, Kevin's eyes fell on someone. It was Shimomura, the man with the triumphant eyes and the main role in his capture. The prosecution was trying to convince the judge that Kevin was incredibly dangerous. There were even preposterous claims that Kevin could fire nuclear missiles by whistling on the phone. He was not a murderer or a terrorist, but as the man who invented hacking in his time, no one knew what he was capable of. So everyone was incredibly wary of him. So much so that he was kept alone in solitary confinement for 8 months before his trial. No one knew what would happen if he got together with other prisoners or made a phone call. While he was inside, his colleagues on the outside were hacking into the websites of big companies, including Yahoo, and posting huge freedom for Kevin on their home pages. But it was all in vain. On the outside, he became a hero and icon of the hacker community, but on the inside, he waited for his trial to be concluded under incredibly harsh conditions. He was finally found guilty of 14 counts of wire fraud and various computer crimes in 1999. The judge sentenced him to 46 months for the latter offences, plus an extra 22 months for violating his probation, for a total of nearly 6 years in prison. But since he had already been imprisoned since 1995, he had already served most of his sentence by the time his case was heard. In fact, in February 2000, after serving his 5th year in prison, he was eligible for release on condition that he would not use almost any technological device for 3 years. In the post-release period, Kevin would try to lead a relatively quiet life. The long years of chase, imprisonment and isolation had left deep scars on him. The once cyber-rebellious teenager was now a man approaching his late 30s. In the future, the restrictions on him would be lifted, and with a computer gifted to him by Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, and a note from him saying, "Now hack legally," he would start his own company, ironically offering security software and leak prevention services to corporations. Up until then, he had never stolen a dime from hacking. Software vulnerability is not a problem. It is solved somehow. You can't patch human stupidity, he said, emphasizing that the real problems of the companies he had hacked in the past were their employees, not their systems. He would even serve the government and collaborate with the FBI. He would even come to the fore as a writer and write books, but after being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2022, he would only survive his illness for a year and a half and would die in July of 2023 at the age of 53. His wife was pregnant with their first child when he passed away. He managed to become the world's greatest hacker, but passed away before he could become a father. His adventure, which started with bus ticket punchers and extended to the networks of the world's largest companies, ended with his illness.